Alright, so here we are. We're finally taking a look at the Fractal Design Era ITX. And for those of you who follow me on Twitter or Instagram, you'll know that this is a case that I passed up on. I wasn't initially going to review it, as taking one look at the case, you really have no ventilation at all. So I knew straight away that this wasn't going to be exactly a positive review. However, since its launch, I've been getting so many messages every single day. Instagram DMs, Twitter, and of course here on YouTube, asking my thoughts about the Era. And some people have said that they've already bought it and they want to know my thoughts on optimizing airflow, for example. So I figured I'd buy one for review, seeing as I already said no to Fractal Design, and I'm going to share my thoughts and of course the testing with you today. Now, instead of me trying to prove to you guys why I wasn't initially going to review it and why you shouldn't buy it, let's take a look at this case through a fresh set of lenses, and let's start with the positives. So I think we can all agree that a lot of thought has been put into the exterior shell of the Era ITX. The front and side panels are anodized aluminium, and we've got some nice soft contouring to give the case some shape. It's not the usual blocky minimal cases that I personally go for, but it's original, and I think Fractal pulled this off quite well. You've got quite a few different creative color options, which is nice. The one I've got here is the titanium variant. It's a dark silver with a slight tint of blue, and it does look pretty nice in person. Taking a closer look at those panels though, one thing to note is the lack of uniformity when it comes to the finish. The side panels look a bit smoother and more matte compared to the front panel, which looks like your typical sandblasted and anodized metal material. Mine also arrived with a few scratches on one of the sides and some edge imperfections, which is definitely not something that you expect from a $160 case. Most of the exterior is aluminium, but the bottom panel is plastic, and unfortunately so is the rear panel. That one has a bit of flex. On the note of case ventilation, there really isn't much at all. The cutouts in the side panels are a clear example of form over function. They're mostly there to look good, let's be real. The fact that your components will now be able to breathe a little is probably secondary. In terms of size, Fractal did okay here. The Era ITX is 16.7 liters, which makes it around 4 liters bigger than the Ncase M1 and just a touch smaller than the Streacom DA2. But the Era ITX has another case to worry about, and that's the new NZXT H1. More on that in just a minute. Front I/O is fairly stacked for an ITX case. We've got USB 3.1 Gen 2 Type-C, two 3.0 Type-A, and a 3.5mm headphone and mic jack. If you want to use that USB Type-C, just know that your motherboard will need an internal Type-C header. That's a pretty rare sight. Now, the top panel is interesting. Some color options will have a tempered glass panel here, but the titanium version has a refreshing walnut panel. Apart from this completely blocking airflow to the top-mounted radiator, visually it is a nice touch. The top panel is also magnetically attached, allowing you to perform the easiest and most effective change to this case, and that's to swap the wood panel to the included mesh panel. Thankfully, we have at least some resemblance here of the Fractal design that we know and love, offering some sort of thermal design to what is otherwise a small desktop oven. The side panels are also completely toolless. These ones are secured via push pins. So I think the form factor and the external finish of the Era ITX is probably what has most people interested in this case. I can definitely see why a lot of you would want this on your desk, but now let's discuss some more important topics, and let's start with the internal layout. This is arguably the most important factor when it comes to a small form factor case. It's how the internal layout has been optimized to offer the best hardware compatibility while also considering the thermal requirements of that hardware. The first thing that you will see when you open up the case is the side-mounted storage bracket, which is pretty straightforward. Either a single 3.5-inch drive or two 2.5-inch drives can be mounted here if you need it, but it's unlikely that you will because you have another internal bracket with the same compatibility. Towards the front of the case is where the power supply will be mounted. We've got room for either an SFX power supply or an ATX unit, but I'd highly recommend just sticking to SFX. If you go with ATX, you're honestly just wasting space. Top-mounted radiator compatibility does get eaten up quite a bit, and you no longer have that internal storage bracket. But now let's talk about graphics card support. So the spec sheet claims that you can fit cards up to 295mm in length, which is honestly quite a bit, and that's quite encouraging, but really you're going to have a hard time fitting anything longer than 270mm in this case. The card that's currently installed in there is the RTX 2070 Super Founders Edition, which measures just 267mm long, and even that took some maneuvering to fit in. What's much worse though is the restriction on graphics card height, and here you've basically only got enough room for reference height cards. So the 2070 Super FE was basically just short enough to fit in here. Remember that you've also got to factor in the added length of the PCIe power cable plugs. This rules out pretty much all aftermarket 5700 and 5700 XT cards, which are typically quite tall, and that's a huge oversight on Fractal Design's behalf. And yes, 2 slot cards only. You might have noticed also that both intake and exhaust ventilation around the graphics card is extremely poor. Now let's move on to cooling, and for CPU coolers you've got up to 120 mils of cooler height clearance, but I'd highly recommend just sticking to liquid cooling instead. At the top of the Era ITX you can install either a 240mm radiator or dual 120mm, and this combined with the mesh top panel is going to be your best approach to CPU cooling. A 240mm radiator can easily be installed onto the top radiator bracket, although I think a dual 120mm configuration would be a bit trickier to manage. You've got enough clearance for a 30mm thick radiator along with a pair of 25mm thick standard fans, basically your common AIOs, plus a bit of breathing room. Now for optimizing airflow pressure through the radiator, I'd recommend mounting the fans like shown, extracting hot air directly from the radiator and exhausting it upwards. There's an 80mm rear fan included. It doesn't do a whole lot, but in summary, positioning this as intake will help CPU thermals by a couple of degrees, whereas leaving it as exhaust will help GPU thermals by about 1 degree. The choice is up to you. Now, building in the Era ITX actually isn't too bad. The cable management though is a little bit tricky. If you're not using any 2.5-inch or 3.5-inch drives, you can use that otherwise empty space to route some of the cable slack. There's also a bit of room next to the motherboard tray on the flip side. But now let's talk about the thermals, and let's start with the positives. So for CPU thermals, the Era ITX is actually not bad at all when using the top mesh panel and when having the fans oriented how I mentioned earlier. With our 9900K, we're averaging out to 75.8 degrees C after 20 minutes in Blender, and that really is not a bad result. However, when using that beautiful walnut panel, we get around a 20 degrees C increase. For a $160 case, that is just not acceptable at all, but thankfully Fractal Design have included that mesh panel, which does fix that. Overall, the Era ITX would be adequate for a 9900K, 3950X and below, but only when using that mesh panel. So up until this point, you're probably thinking that this is the case for you. The Era ITX has a beautiful exterior and CPU thermals can support some of the most powerful mainstream desktop CPUs that we can build with today. But it's when we take a look at GPU thermals that we realize how poorly designed this case actually is. It does seriously make me wonder, did Fractal Design even build a gaming system in this case and turn it on to test it? Were there any engineers at all who worked on this case, or was it just a design team? GPUs do need airflow. We're talking about hundreds of watts of power being dumped into a small volume. You can't just close the thing off and call it okay. This case truly is a disaster for any gaming system. Here's what you can expect in terms of noise while you're kicking back to enjoy a few games. So a bit of a message to Fractal's design team who worked on this case. If your customers are looking to buy a $150 ITX case, and most of them are going to be building a gaming system, they're probably going to be using something like a 5700 XT or a 2070 Super at least. And you really should start there as the starting point. You should aim to support those graphics cards both physically and thermally. We don't really have the physical part because most 5700 XTs won't fit in this case. And then thermally, it really is just a disaster. Some of the best small form factor cases that I've reviewed have taken that approach. They've started with the physical dimensions and the thermal requirements of the hardware that they want to support, and then they construct a nice sort of shell around that. That's kind of an example of how to design an optimized case, and this is definitely not that. If you were considering this case, I would highly recommend the NZXT H1 instead. It can be had for around the same price once you factor in the value of the included AIO and power supply. It's both smaller and it runs cooler, and it is much easier to build in. Also consider the Ncase M1 if you don't mind something a bit more premium. It can be had for about $50 more. I still consider it the best overall small form factor case that I've tested, and they do seem to be fulfilling orders at least at the time of filming. So that's where we're left with the Fractal Design Era ITX, and I mean, I had a feeling this case would be bad, but I mean, for gaming systems, it's really bad. You should highly avoid this case. I don't feel right in linking it down below. I always say, you know, if you're interested, find it down below, but I'm not gonna link it. I will link some alternatives instead though. As always, guys, a huge thanks for watching, and I'll see you all in the next one.